something from the Noda Yehuda in the Biurim. He had quoted the Noda Yehuda. And we'll just back up a little bit just to review. He says, "Di'im echad mehatstadim machnis es." Do I have shared the screen? Let's see. Share screen. I don't even know if I don't think anyone else is on. Actually, he says. Di'im echad mehatstadim machnis es ohavo okrovo. Sorry. Yeah. Dim echad mehatstadim machnes is ohavo okrovo ligmor hadavar. That, let's say we've the two sides, the two families have started using a shadchan, and then one or both sides decide, let's get our friend to finish this off. Okay, so afilu haya biyacholes shel hashadchan harisha lahashvosam gam kein bipratim halalu. He says even if the first shadchan had the wherewithal and the ability to close the deal, and the sides, the parties of interest decided instead that they were going to use a relative or a friend, and in doing so, this puts the shadchan at a position where he's not going to make his shadchanis fee. He says the Noda Yehuda, who lives in the 18th century, says there's nothing wrong with that. He says there's no deceit here. And the shadchan can only express his displeasure to the two sides, but he has no legal recourse. He says, "V'nira degam lefi ma demashma b'dvar b'shal anoda b'Yehuda de tarmus al kopanim yesh baze vein roi lasus kein lechatchila." He says it seems from the language of the Noda b'Yehuda, when you say ein lo alav elatar umas, all you have is the ability to express your displeasure. Sounds like it's not a very nice thing to do. You're causing someone to lose out on his shadchanas. Legally, you're within your rights to do it, but you're causing this person to become disgruntled. So perhaps, it sounds like from the language that you shouldn't do it. It's not the ethical thing. But he says, but Rav Stern writes, he says, that's provided that the first shadchan was doing everything that you wanted him to do and was really doing a top-notch job, as well as the person that you brought in to replace him. Okay, the Noda Yehuda writes explicitly. Well, let's say you have a concern that this first shadchan is not doing things in the way that you want him to do it. Perhaps, like we said last time, they're being overly aggressive, or they're turning off one of the boy or the girl, or they may be too intrusive or not intrusive enough. Or whatever other reason they feel that the second person that they're putting in the first person's place would be more effective in maintaining the relationship. Okay, de'ein bazeh afilu tarumas. Then you don't even have to feel guilty about it. The guy doesn't even have a right to express his displeasure. The hashadchan harishon yikabel scharo mishalem kamo shemagilo al pi hadin kemaschil. And then when it comes to pay the shadchanas, he gets paid for being the starter, the opener. Yeah, dahainu shlish, which is 1/3. Ulam heter zeh amor legabe hatstadim. Aval legabe hashadchan hasheni yesh bo iser ba'asr lo likanes l'shidduch shehu roa shekvar misnal al yedei shadchan rishon. But everything that we've set up until now is regarding the two families whose children are being matched together. But as far as the second shadchan, if the second shadchan pushes their way in, his or her way in, to undermine the first shadchan's efforts, he says that's wrong. He says that's not permitted, because remember we learned this principle of ani hamahapech becharara, You're not allowed to insert yourself into a business arrangement that has already been started. You can't take away someone else's business. Virak im nisbakesh al yedei hatzadim az shari lekanal. The second shadchan can only enter into the scene if he has been requested to by the sides, but not if he initiates the practice. Okay. Now, before we start the next sif, I just wanted to make one more point. I was snooping around in the Likutim. He quotes a sefer that I had honestly never heard of. The sefer was called Shulchan HaEzer. There's a lot I don't know, right? So there's the sefer called Shulchan HaEzer. I had no idea what it was about, but he said if you want, you can look there in chapter 3 over there. He has many issues as far as what the financial obligations are of paying a shadchan. So fortunately, I was able to find the sefer on my Otzer HaChachma, and I want to share. First of all, here's the Sharblat of Shulchan HaEzer. It was written in the early 20th century. Typeset is not great, but it was written by a fellow whose name is Lebovich or Levovitz. It's not clear. Yitzchak Tzvi Leibovich or Lebovich or something, however you pronounce it. And he basically writes, and he writes a commentary on his work. So he wrote the work Shulchan HaEzer, which tells you the halachos, and he writes a commentary called Samlo Latzvi, Asher Bo Avaer Kol Davar Mimekoro Mishulchan Aruch VaHaposkim Hagdolim, where I will explain to you my sources from all of the different original places where the sources appeared for the basis for the halacha. Kibbutz Gadol, rather, Misfarm Chadosh and V'Yashanim Kol Hilchos Gadolos Mikol Inyane Nisuei Ishus. Right? It's basically a collection of a whole bunch of different halachos having to do with the laws of marriage. And I looked up chapter 3, and it's only 4 seifim, but it's 16 pages long. So why is it 16 pages long? Because in the way that he writes his commentary, as you can see, there's very, very little text in the actual halacha, and it's surrounded by this very long commentary of where his sources are. So this chapter 3, Siman Gimel, is Dinei Schar Shadchanos, Uvo Dalet Sifim, the laws of paying the wages for Shadchanos, for the Shadchan, and it has 4 paragraphs. Let's just read it'll take us longer to scroll through than it'll take us to read the text. So let's learn Halacha Aleph. Hashadchan Havi Kemosir Sur, Vidino Kishaliach. The text, the typeset is not that clear. The Shadchan is an agent, and he has the status of a shaliach, of a proxy. She'ein sarich kinyan v'lo edim. You don't need to make a kinyan. You don't need to have edim to consider his services to be retained halachically. V'lo mikri shadchan ela kishadiber misach hanedunya. He says he doesn't become assigned as the shadchan unless he speaks first about the fee that will come from the dowry. Umekabel scharo me'erech hanedunya kefi minhag hamadina, and he agrees, and it's negotiated that he will receive his fee from the dowry that will be provided by the families. Okay? In other words, the whole concept of shadchanos is linked to the dowry, which means that if there's no dowry that is provided, it sounds like from Rav Levovitz that there's no shadchanos fee. There has to be, the two of them are linked together. Now, where he gets this from, if we were to look at his sources, he says, Ayin b'shul shilos etshuvas Evan Yakara, Chelik Aleph, or maybe we should actually start earlier. Hold on one second. So he says, Hashadchen, Bevor b'choshen Mishpat sof simin kuf be'hesif yud b'ramasham, where the Ramah talks about this whole halacha. V'dino shenotel scharo afilu shelo hisna imo mikodem. He says the halacha is that he is entitled to compensation even if he did not make any negotiation in advance. The stama kenhu ayin sham, because there's an assumption that there's going to be a payment for shadchanas. Va'ayin b'shut harashtam chilak or even ha'ezer, etc. De'ein sarch kinyan v'lo edim rak ba'amira ba'alma chayv litan lo mashi hivtiach lo. He says you don't need even a kinyan, any kind of transactional, mechanism. If there's a verbal agreement, so then you're going to be obligated. Okay. And v'gam ha delo havishadchen rakim diber mehanadunya. He says, where does this idea come from? That you don't get the assignment of a shadchan unless you first discuss the dowry. Bevor kain b'shem chukei derech umuva pischei tshuva, and this is he brings all of his sources. He brings from Yalkut Shimoni from the Medrash in Parshas Yisro, Mashazacha Moshe Rabbeinu lekeren or panav. The reason why Moshe had the merit of having beams of light shining off of his face is Mishum Shahaya Sirsur B'Shadchan Ben Yisrael LaHashem Yisbarach Ayin Sham, is because he was the Shadchan. He was the agent to make the. It's perfect, right? He was the Shadchan between God and Israel to make sure that this deal went through. The Muchach Tzas Deika Tzas Mitzvah L'Shadech Bite Yisrael Zelazeh. He says, or Bate Yisrael Zelazeh. You see that there's a mitzvah from that medrash to make these matches. V'gam Shayach Be'inzek Tzas Uladov Kovo. He says, and also you fulfill this idea of attaching yourself to Hashem, because we know that the Darshu Razal Hidavek B'midosa, that you're supposed to, what does it mean to attach yourself to God? It means to emulate Hashem's behavior and Hashem's midos. Umavur b'Moshe b'Medrash Rabbah Parshasav da'Kodesh Baruch Hu me'esha barolamo u'mezavik zivugim ayin sham. And we know from the Medrash that there was once a woman who asked Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, what is God doing from the time of creation till the present? And he answered her that God is making shiduchim. V'chemedume sheraisi be'ez sefer mehakdoshim la'or brazeh va'ayin b'tanat ve'eliyahu v'matei Moshe v'chol inyani nisunu minhagim novim mimatan Torah ayin sham. He says all of the matters of marriage and all of the customs really come from the practice or the event of the giving of the Torah. And he also writes, quoting from the Shilos of Shuvas Chavas Yoer, the Hamezavek Bagoyim Ein Isser. He says there's to even make Shiduchim for non-Jews, there's no prohibition. He says not that there's a mitzvah, but there's no prohibition. Umilanu Gadol Meharamban Asa Refuos Lagoya Sheteled Kamoshikasav Shuvas Arashba. I guess in other words, there's no Isser of helping a non-Jew. Yeah, obviously. Okay, all right, we're not going to go to the rest of it. Okay, there's obviously a lot of stuff here. So let me just finish reading the main halacha. Umekabel scharo me'erech hanadunya kefi minhag hamedina, everything according to the established norm of the established custom. Then he writes, Ve'im yesh v'hashidduch eze shadchanim. If in the shidduch there are multiple shadchanim, azai yesh din, then the you can see is din maschil v'goimer ve'emsoi. So then you can break down between the opener, the closer, and the middleman. In other words, sometimes you could have three parties involved. And then he says, Uzman hatash. So that's why you have the opener gets a third and the closer gets 2/3, I guess, because the closer is considered to be doing the middleman part. So what does he bring up from over here? Let's see. He brings from the following. He says, "Im echad hischel hashidduch v'lo ratza echad me'atzdadim v'asa shidduch acher." He says, let's say a guy started the shidduch. He started to negotiate to put two families together, and then one of the sides backs out, and he decides to move on and try with another shidduch. Ve'achar kach hutar hakesher ve'asa shidduch harishon al yedei acher. And so what happened is that the effort that fellow, one of the parents pulled out of that initial shidduch and tried a shidduch with another family. That fell apart. So he goes back to the original shidduch that let's say Yankel was working on, but instead of using Yankel, he uses Shimon instead. Because of Denira Diesh Litain Lahamaschel Harishon Ezechelek. And he writes in this tshuva, you have to give Yankel something because he started it. Dein zed doime lemekach hamavur b'choshen Mishpat ki b'shiduchin echad me'elef yachol l'shayr ma doime lemi. He says because it's not similar to purchases, because when it comes to shiduchim, sometimes it's one in 1,000. It's a needle in a haystack to put two people together. He says, so therefore you have to give credit to this Yankel who started the shidduch process, because who's to say that anyone else would have thought of it? Okay. Etc. He says, Yesh l'shalim dover mala hamaschal ayin sham. You have to give something to the opener. Then he quotes from another sefer. He says, the damya ulai ha'ani echad mehatstadim ve'ein lo l'salek haneduni v'chakach nisasher v'adei de lo chashav shidduch chadash rak hasoras haminiya. He says, perhaps the reason why the shidduch didn't work out originally is because one of the family that was considered undesirable couldn't come up with the fee for the nedunya, so the other family backed out. But let's say that that family that couldn't afford the nedunya then came upon a fortune, and then everything's tied in with finance in the old days. It's very, very different from the way we make shidduchim today. So anyway, let's see. Anyway, so you have the opener, the closer, and the middleman.
Somewhat less.
It would seem that way.
That's
it would seem that way. Right. Yep. Yeah. Okay. So many different permutations, right? Okay. Then he continues and he says, Uzman hatashlumin, when does payment become due? Who Kefi haminag b'chol medina u'medina. It all depends on the established convention. we saw before, it could either be at the time of the Tanaim or at the time of the Chuppah. Uvemakom she'ein minhag hadinim haba'olim. And in a place where there's no minhag, then the families have the upper hand because the shadchan can't claim you owe me at such and such a time, right? So they have the upper hand because there is no established norm. Okay. Now, Sif Beis. Atoveya mechavero shadchanas. B'zeh kafar v'amar shalo haya shadchan shalo. If a person, Yankel comes over to the father of the chassan, the father of the kala, and says, okay, pay me the shadchanas that you owe me. And the father says, I don't know what you're talking about. You weren't the shadchan here. So, o sha'ar tanos, or any other kinds of responses, shebenehem dino ki b'shar tfios v'nishpon al kach. He says it's no different from any other financial conflict that has to go to Beis Din. And if the Beis Din institutes oaths, will make each side take an oath. Bim lefira os Beis Din tainos geruos v'chalu shosein einos dim shavua. And if the Beis Din sees that the claims are weak or faulty, then they won't even institute an oath. But they will threaten that whoever is the lying party will be placed under a ban. We don't do this today. We don't do any of that today. But apparently, I guess, in the early part of the 20th century, they were still instituting oaths. Number 3, if the shadchan negotiates that his fee will be higher than the accepted norm, he's the premium service. He only gets the finest girls, and he provides the full service. So afilu nasan lo alzeh shtarchov o mashkon. He says, even if there was a contract drawn up or collateral provided, he says, if the community has a fixed amount, then he's only allowed to take what was fixed in the community. But in a community where there's not a fixed amount, yeshalem lo kefi shehisna, then you have to pay him what was stipulated. Aval binishba onasan. But if, even when there's a convention, if an oath was taken to give him what he demanded, onasan to kias kaf, or there was a handshake made on the deal, afilu asu bikinin litin lo yoser miakatsu, or they made a kinyan, which I guess would be also tantamount to signing a contract, right? To pay the shadchan more than the established amount, chayev litain lo kol masha pasak. Then you have to give him anything that was agreed upon. Yeah, it sounds like he contradicted himself, because previously he said, nasan lo al zeh shtarchov o mashkon. So shtarchov probably doesn't mean a promissory note. It probably means I don't know. I don't know how he's going to have a tough time wiggling out of this one, but I'm not sure. Yeah, no, that's right. You can always contract out of normal practice. Okay. V'chenim nasan lo kfar ma'os afilu masro liyad shlish. He says, and furthermore, if you already paid his fee, which is higher than the standard, okay, or afilu masro liyad shlish, or you give it to an escrow, a third party, ein motziin miyadam, then you can't take it away from the shadchan. V'cheinin is chayiv es atzmo yoser machmas shtad lanus mitorah chayiv litein lo kol masha pasak lo. And furthermore, If he claims that he's I think what it means is that he claims that he's working harder. I'm not sure what this means, the shtadlanus, but in any event, then you have to, since he's giving you added value, you have to even biblically give him what was agreed upon. If there's a conflict where the shadchan says, you promised to pay me this high fee, and the balabaya says, no, I only agreed to pay you the standard fee, then he's only entitled to the standard fee unless he brings evidence. Okay? And finally, b'makom shemishalmin hashadchanus acher hatnoim, afal pi im nispadlu hashiduchim umachlu hamechutanim zelazeh hashadchan lo hifzit schara. He says, if when the minhag is to pay the shadchanus after the tanoim are drawn up, which was in those days was done at the time of the engagement, even if the shidduch ends up falling apart and the mechutanim are moichel each other, the shadchan has not lost his wages. Aval b'makom she'ein mishalmin ad hanisuin v'nispatel hashidduch, but in a place where they don't pay they don't pay the shadchan until the actual wedding, and then the engagement breaks. Piturim milashalem lahashadchan scharo. Then they're putter from paying the shadchan his wages. Ele imkain hisnu beferush almanas sheyit payes, unless they made an arrangement differently, that almanas sheyit payes. That if that was the, in other words, if the guy complains when the engagement breaks and they say, okay, we'll pay you so and so, even though the shidduch didn't go through, then you have to give him whatever you promised. Then even if there's a back, it's one or both parties back out. Okay, so obviously there's a lot more here, but I figured I would just show you the sefer so you have this idea that Rav Stern wasn't pulling this stuff out of thin air. Apparently there was an entire sefer that was composed, the whole chapter in the sefer has to do with the financial aspects of paying shadchanas. We'd have to really spend a lot of time unpacking these sources to find out how much of this is applicable to modern times. So much has changed in the area of shidduchim today that it's very difficult to extrapolate, what does apply and what doesn't apply to modern times. And it would be a fascinating study, but if I had the time, maybe I would be interested in doing this because it really is a fascinating discussion, but I guess we'll have to just go weiter. Okay, we'll hold it here for today. Nice to see you.